Good evening, everyone. We have another wonderful program for you tonight. Our guest speaker is award-winning reporter, editor, and author, Michelle Nijhuis. Michelle's going to tell us about her new book, Beloved Beasts, Fighting for Life in an Age of Extinction. So a very timely subject, written with a wonderful writer's voice. Michelle has had her work published in National Geographic, New York Times Magazine. She's the project editor for the Atlantic, contributing editor for High Country News, a co-editor of Science Writers Handbook, among others. So, she lives with her family in White Salmon, Washington. So I have a couple of quick things to read from the book to give you some perspective. Here it says, it's a vibrant history of the modern conservation movement told through the lives and ideas of the people who built it. From some glowing reviews, I'll abbreviate, but let's see. Michelle Nijhuis has written a book that is both as beautiful, wise history and a measured call to action. What a lovely, timely book. And I apologize, holding the book up, I don't have any light to read the back. So I'll skip to the last one. The centuries-long campaign to protect our fellow creatures finally has the literary epic it deserves. And that is a quote from our local author, Ben Goldfarb. So as Alan said earlier, we have 2 signed copies that we'll be giving away at the end of the program. And so you'll please want to stick around for that. Also, I'm told that additional signed copies are available at Wishing Tree Books, which is on 11th Avenue in the Perry District. So just in time for holiday gifting for yourself or others. So please check that out. And with that, I'd like to turn the meeting over to our special guest speaker, Michelle Nijhuis.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Good. Let me share my screen. So, oh, good. I think we've got that. So thank you for having me tonight. I may have talked to some of you last month when I was in Spokane with Ben at Wishing Tree Books. I can't claim any skill as a birder, but I have spent a lot of wonderful time with birders, and I really appreciate how what you do for fun helps to connect so many people to the natural world. And one of the most enjoyable parts of my project was getting to dig into the Audubon Society archives at the New York Public Library, which I'll talk a little bit about what I found there in a bit. So I'm going to talk tonight about finding hope in conservation history, and I'm talking about that because during the years that I worked on this book, and since it's been published, whenever I tell people that I have written about conservation history, at least half the time they say something to the effect of, oh, that must have been very sad, or that must be very sad. And I always have to hasten to say, actually, I feel much, well, at least more optimistic, if not much more optimistic now than I did before I wrote the book. So I actually find that the historical perspective, being able to see how far we've come in the last 150 years or so that the modern conservation movement has existed, how much we've learned, how many possibilities are still open to us. I found a lot of hope in that. I don't want to oversell it and say, because I'm certainly well aware of all the problems we face, including some problems that conservationists of the past did not face. But suffice to say that I see a lot of possibility out there, and looking deeply at conservation history only persuaded me further of that. So before I get into hope, let me tell you a little bit about how I came to write the book. This is me in 1996. I was just out of college. I majored in biology, and I spent a couple of years supporting myself as a field technician on wildlife research projects mostly in the desert Southwest. You can tell this was a long time ago because I no longer look like that, but also that yellow stick I'm holding is what at the time was the state of the art device that we were very excited to have. It's a GPS unit. And we were thrilled that we no longer had to use a map and compass to find, to stumble around in the desert and find the flags that we'd left to mark the perimeter of our study sites. But of course, you could use your smartphone to much more quickly and accurately get the GPS locations of the places that we were wanting to remember the locations of today. So these jobs were wonderful. I met a lot of great people. I saw a lot of incredible creatures, but they also brought me up close, disturbingly, but also perhaps most memorably of all, brought me up close with some of the controversies over endangered species in the rural West, which, as you all well know, are still ongoing today. And I was struck not only by how vitriolic these controversies were, and some of them, including some that descended into violence, but just how basic and profound the questions were that people were discussing. In coffee shops and in town halls, they weren't really arguing about what they were supposed to be arguing about, which was, they were often part of these federal land planning processes where they were supposed to be, fighting over, well, should we put this over or ORV trail here or there, or should we close this one or that one? Instead, they were arguing about, why is this our responsibility? Why are we protecting this species and not this one? Who cares anyway? Why are we stuck with this? And as someone who was interested in conservation, I had this vague sense that smart people from the past had talked about these questions and come up with some provisional answers. But I think also, like most people who are interested in conservation, I didn't have a strong sense of conservation as a tradition, as I knew famous names, but I didn't have a sense of how it had developed over time. So I came out of these years moving around the Southwest and listening to people argue about endangered species with a lot of very strong and in some cases wonderful memories, but also a lot of unresolved questions. And I became a journalist. I continued to think and write about conservation. And I continued to notice that when I covered endangered species controversies, the same thing was always happening. People were getting stuck in these very basic issues. Why are we doing this? Whose responsibility is it? And of course, those questions can't be resolved even in a couple of years of meetings. So when if any kind of resolution was reached, it was not satisfying to hardly anyone involved. And over time, I started to think, well, maybe it would be useful in some small way if I tried to put together the history of conservation thus far in a way that is accessible to a wide variety of people. So these ellipses represent about 20 years. And at the end of it, I came up with my book, Beloved Beasts. It was really important to me to have this be a book, as I said, that was accessible to a lot of people, not just conservation professionals or people who were already interested in conservation, but people who just had a passing interest in wildlife and animals and wanted to know more. So I knew I couldn't possibly write the whole history of conservation in a reasonably sized book, nor did I want to. But I tried to represent what I came to refer to as the modern conservation movement, tried to show its major ideas, some of its major figures, and show the trajectory of where it's come since the late 19th century. And the way I decided to do that, my daughter thinks that this slide looks like a Zoom conference with everyone in my book, which always makes me think, oh, that would be so wonderful if only it were possible. but I chose about a dozen people that I built the story around and or built my narrative around. And I don't worry, I won't go through all of them, but just to say, just to show you where I started or mention where I started out, the fellow up in the upper left-hand corner is William Temple Hornaday, who many of you may have heard of. He was instrumental in bringing the bison back from the proverbial edge of extinction in the early 1900s, primarily by raising a herd of bison at what is now called the Bronx Zoo and shipping them out to Oklahoma by train. And they became the seat of a herd that's now one of several federal herds and is part of a much larger, more ambitious bison restoration project that's led primarily by tribes and First Nations throughout North America, and that's happening today. So Hornaday was a very complicated man with a lot of flaws, but he was, as I said, instrumental in it. He's one primary reason why we have the bison today. And he was representative of many of the first members of the modern conservation movement, in that he was an elite, wealthy hunter. He had been a trophy hunter in his youth. And he was primarily interested in protecting species that he genuinely loved, but also to him represented were worth protecting because they represented national pride. They represented the protection of white masculinity. His reasons for protecting them did not have much to do with their ecological value, though, as I said, he genuinely appreciated their value, their beauty and their value. So over time, over the last few decades, the conservation movement has become more sophisticated about science, about ecology. It incorporated many of the things that have been learned by ecologists over the 20th century. It has worked to protect a broader variety of species, not just charismatic mammals like the bison, but also insects, animals large and small, including species that many people consider pests. It has broadened out from its beginnings in North America and Europe, and in many cases followed colonial paths. Can you hear me now? Okay. Hopefully you can hear me. So it has become more international, and it has also become more inclusive of a greater variety of people of different races, of different ages, and in recent years of different strategies and ideologies. So if I had to articulate one or two of the greatest accomplishments of the modern conservation movement, I would say it has successfully connected people with species that they may never encounter in life, but whose fates they nevertheless affect. Thanks to the conservation movement, there are millions of people all over the world who care about the existence of tigers and rhinos and tropical birds. They may never encounter them because of where they live or who they are, but they care about them and they recognize that their decisions, including their consumer decisions, have some effect on the fate of those species. And then the conservation movement has also created institutions that allow people to work across political boundaries to protect species, which, as we all know, don't often respect political boundaries and often and whose ranges often cross them. So I think those two things have been very important. I think the failures of the conservation movement, many of the failures of the conservation movement, and my book is a critical history. I wanted to capture the missed opportunities and failures as well as the accomplishments. I think those have a great deal to do with the beginnings of the conservation movement in elite circles in Europe and North America, because there has been a longstanding I think, blindness to the ability of ordinary people to live alongside their the species they depend on for various reasons, for protein, for shelter, for livelihoods. And that has led to, especially when the conservation movement went international, I'll talk about this a little bit later on, but that led to, I think, an overdependence on the creation of parks and reserves and game laws, which, as we all know, are very important, but those are just one set of strategies in conservation, and this bias, I think, that was built into the early conservation movement led to a distrust of people's ability to manage the wildlife they lived with, and led to people overlooking chances to support ordinary people in living sustainably alongside the wildlife that they, again, depended on for food and protein. So this evolution, I think one way of looking at it is that the modern conservation movement has, in fact, evolved to realize what people all over the world have recognized for millennia, long before the modern conservation movement existed, which is that conservation is about much more than preventing extinction. And the way I think of it is that it's about protecting relationships. It's about, and all of you know this as well as I do, it's about protecting relationships among species, between species and their habitats. And I think the conservation movement is belatedly coming to the realization that it's about protecting relationships between humans and other species. And that evolution over the last 150 years has come about in large part because of the relationships among conservationists. And one of the great joys of my research project was being able to follow some of the relationships among different generations of conservationists and see how their work built on one another's work and affected very profound change. So I want to tell you a couple of stories about those relationships and their consequences. The first one, I think you'll be familiar with at least some elements of, and the second one, perhaps less so. So let me take you to birding the old-fashioned way. And many of you may be familiar with this. In the late 1800s, before the advent of inexpensive optics, the way to get close to a beautiful bird was to kill it. And many naturalists, professional and amateur of the time, both professional and amateur, didn't think much of just killing a few dozen birds and taking the skins back to their home laboratories or to their institutions for closer study. And because natural history was such a popular pastime in that era, and this actually had started to have make quite a dent in some species of birds. And we know now that species like the Carolina parakeet that we've since lost, we're not driven extinct by any means by naturalists, but their decline was hastened by people who just could not resist shooting a few more of these just jewel-like birds, so that they could get a closer look. I mean, these were birds that they loved and were curious about, and didn't really think much about the long-term consequences of how they were studying them. And songbirds, and I should back up and say, remember, this is a time when there were a few restrictions on how much game people could hunt in North America, a few local restrictions on how many animals one could shoot, but there were no laws of any significance protecting songbirds, which people didn't need for protein, and they were assumed to be just fine on their own. People were certainly aware that extinction could happen, but it was not something that was front of mind for many people. So, oops, excuse me. Birds were also under, skipped a slide here. Oh no. Sorry about that. birds were also under threat from these beautiful hats. And now many of you know at least part of the story, I'm sure, that people have decorated themselves with feathers since time immemorial, and there have been several fads of wearing feathers on hats throughout history. The fad that arose in the late 1800s and early 1900s was different, in part because fashion became much more democratic. You no longer had to go to a dressmaker or to a milliner to have a hat or a dress specially made to measure for you. If you were a middle-class woman in Europe and North America, you could pick up a catalog and order a hat or a dress in your size and have it sent to you in the mail. So it wasn't just extremely wealthy women who were buying hats with feathers on them. Millions of women were buying them. And like most fads, this one escalated from the kind of mild to the ridiculous. It started out with people just wearing a few feathers on their hats, and as you can see here, became people wearing entire wings, whole birds. There were even examples of people wearing entire birds in kind of terraria with moss and rocks and rats and plants on their hats. So this was a extremely long-lasting and widespread fad, and it had an enormous toll on birds. This was a part of a famous series of photographs that were taken of egret hunting in Australia, and actually caused a lot of consternation when they were published. And these are egret chicks. It was common practice for plume hunters to shoot adult egrets, some of whom were mother egrets taking care of their young who were not old enough to survive. So of course, when the mothers were killed, the egrets, the baby egrets slowly starved. And this is a photo of hummingbird skins that were for sale at the quarterly London feather sale. You can see quite cheaply, even by the standards of the time. And this kind of thing happened 4 times a year. So you can start to imagine the scale at which this was going on. 5 million birds were killed each year at the height of the popularity of the plume trade. And so people did eventually get concerned about the toll of this fad on birds, and perhaps predictably, their first move was to blame the women wearing the hats. So there were a lot of cartoons like this one showing beautifully dressed women holding the gun and shooting the birds while men looked on in horror. William Hornaday, who I mentioned a few minutes ago, published this screed on the women's page of the New York Times, scolding women for their choices. I'm not sure how well this went across with his audience, but he certainly knew who to blame, or thought he knew who to blame. And it took Virginia Woolf, the author Virginia Woolf, to respond to this. She wrote a quite tart letter to a London newspaper. She was involved with trying to pass laws restricting the plume trade in the UK. And she started her letter saying, look, I have no sympathy for a society woman who chooses to wear a lemon-colored egret as an evening accessory, but let's remember that birds are killed by men, starved by men, and tortured by men, not vicariously, but with their own hands. And so she didn't mention that women, as well as being the primary customers of the plume trade, were also at the forefront of the effort to fight the plume trade. And I really like the story of Florence Merriam Bailey, who wrote one of the first bird guides. It was called Birding Through an Opera Glass. And this was just when binoculars were starting to become commercially available. And this book was so important in encouraging people to get on their bicycle on the weekend and go out and see what they could find with their binoculars. And it really encouraged naturalists to stop shooting birds and start looking for them through their binoculars. So that went a long way towards solving the problem of beautiful or rare birds being made vulnerable by people loving them too much. And Florence Merriam Bailey had a long life. She wrote a lot of books after writing her first bird guide, but she didn't get an obituary in the New York Times when she died. she did get one in 2019. She became part of the Overlooked No More series in the New York Times, and which is a series of obituaries written long after the death of the notable person in an effort to look back in history and see who the New York Times omitted from their pages at the time. So I was glad to see Florence Marion Bailey memorialized belatedly, but deservedly. Also, Harriet Lawrence Hemingway, many of you may have heard of. She was instrumental in reviving the Audubon Society after it went more or less moribund after its first decade. It had a bit of a false start, and she helped revive it. She was like many of the women involved in fighting the plume trade. She had gained some of her activist skills in the suffrage movement. She had fought for the right to vote, and then once the right to vote was achieved, she came into the Audubon movement and said, wow, this, let's shake things up. We've been in the streets shouting for our rights. Let's get a little more ambitious here. And she was a very canny organizer, very strategic. So she convinced a lot of women in Boston to stop buying hats, and then she started working with Audubon chapters all over the nation to pass laws against plume hunting itself. So she was attacking both the demand for feathers and the supply. And so after many years of struggle, as you know, these activists succeeded in passing the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, still one of our most powerful conservation laws, perhaps one of the most powerful conservation laws in the world, despite the best efforts of the Trump administration to weaken its provisions. Importantly, most birds of prey were excluded. I'll talk about that in a second. And then in 1921, the UK Parliament passed an equivalent law, and other European nations followed suit. And so by the mid 1920s, the plume trade was essentially hobbled, and the demand for feathers, for feathered hats, never revived. And what was really especially poignant and satisfying about looking into this history was getting to look at some of the Christmas bird counts for the years in the Southeast US after these laws were passed, because very quickly, I mean, as you can imagine, if you stopped killing parent birds that were on the nest, the numbers of birds that survived in the following years just shot up. And so the reports that were coming in from volunteers, all of a sudden, they were starting to see egrets again. And, and by the 1930s, some of these populations were doing really well. So it's a really significant success story, and a real testament to the persistence of the people who were involved, and then of the ability of these populations to recover. However, the job was not done because, as I mentioned, birds of prey were not included in this legislation. And as some of you may know, many of the members of the Audubon Society at the time really considered birds of prey to be pests. Many of them were sportsmen and saw them as competition for prey. Some of them saw them as just nuisance birds that preyed on livestock, or just kind of lower class birds in a sense. They were birds that ate garbage or dead things and weren't that admirable. And so in came an activist named Rosalie Edge, who also came out of the suffrage movement, and she just said this very prescient thing, I think, about what conservation is about, that the birds and animals must be protected, not merely because this species or another is interesting to some group of biologists, but because each is a link in a living chain. And that may not seem that remarkable to us now, but she was working in a time when the word ecosystem was just beginning to be used among scientists. It was the concept of the food chain also was just starting to be discussed among ecologists. These were not terms that were in the popular discourse. They were not familiar to regular people. And Rosalie Edge was not a scientist. She was very sharp and she hung out with scientists, but she was not a scientist herself. But she she saw this very early on, that what was important was to be protecting all species and not just species that you thought were beautiful or admirable. And so she really took the Audubon Society to task. And I talk about it in my book. There were some very funny scenes where she just confronted the members of the Audubon board and called them out for not sticking up for bald eagles. And she eventually recruited so much support among the Audubon membership that she won, and the Audubon Society changed its position on protecting especially eagles, but also all birds of prey. And she was also instrumental in protecting Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, which also many of you may be familiar with. If you do get a chance to go, if you haven't been and you get a chance to go, do go. It's a sanctuary in eastern Pennsylvania, and it is centered around a ridgeline that for many years was a place where local hunters would go during the migration season and just shoot birds as they passed over. Again, this was kind of a community tradition. And again, it was thought to be a beneficial community tradition because people thought, oh, these birds are just pests. They're not that important. Let's shoot them so that they won't be bothering our livestock or bothering other species that we may care about. And Rosalie Edge, knowing what she knew, was just horrified by this. And she purchased the property when it went up for sale and turned it into a sanctuary. And there she is, leaning against a fence post, always in her elegant city garb, even when she was birding. And she not only protected the land, but she also said to the man on the right in the white hat, who was the sanctuary caretaker, Maurice Braun, she said, we should be taking, let's keep track of how many birds and of what species are passing over each year. That might be important for some reason down the road. And so he started doing that. I think he missed 2 years because he was deployed to the Pacific during World War II. But other than that, the record is continuous from the late 1930s to today. It's the longest record of its time. There are many other raptor watch sites and raptor count sites that have been inspired by Hawk Mountain, but Hawk Mountain is still holds the longest record of annual counts. And a few years after Hawk Mountain was founded, that's what it looks like today. You can still go and participate in the count. Hawk Mountain was paid a visit by a young Fish and Wildlife Service employee named Rachel Carson. And she, at the time, she was freelancing magazine articles, and she never published anything about Hawk Mountain, but this was from her notes that were found in her papers after her death. So you can tell she was very struck by just what it was like to stand up on this ridgeline and see birds flying around you, and in some cases under you, because the birds are flying around the cliffs that you're standing upon, and she remembered the place, and she also remembered that data was being collected there. And a few years later, when she started to work on the book Silent Spring, she wrote to Maurice Braun and said, I've heard that I'm working on a book about the effect of DDT on wildlife. I've heard you've made some observations in recent years that might be of interest. And he wrote back immediately and said, oh, yes, we've been taking these records for a long time, so we have a good sense of what's been normal the past couple of decades. And what has been happening the last few years is not normal, because the number of young eagles has been dropping precipitously. And in fact, last year, we didn't see any young eagles at all. And so Rachel Carson, there wasn't experimental evidence at the time of DDT's effect on wildlife. What she basically had were anecdotes. She had individual observations of DDT being applied and then things happening to wildlife. She had she had circumstantial evidence. And so she had to act like a lawyer and build a case. Now we know that it was thinning eggshells, and that's why it had such an effect on many species. But she didn't know that at the time. So she was accumulating these stories, this data, and she, as she wrote in Silent Spring, the work at Hawk Mountain was extremely important to her case against DDT. as popular as Silent Spring was when it came out, and as huge of a effect as it had, I mean, even, it was even cited by President Kennedy in his speech and sparked all kinds of concern at the national level, it still took a decade to ban DDT. And so without the work at Hawk Mountain, it might have taken even longer to ban DDT, and in fact might not have been banned at all. And I often think about this cascade of relationships. If the women who fought the plume trade had not, come out of the suffrage movement saying this is the next cause we're going to take on, if they had not spoken up, if Rosalie Edge had not said, well, that was great, that was really important work, but it's not quite done yet, we need to include all species, and we also need to start watching and taking data on what kinds of species, how species are doing over time, so that we can get an early warning if there's a problem, and made that data available to Rachel Carson, we might live in a very different world today. So as you can see, these relationships add up. This work adds up over time. So let me tell you one more story before I move on to questions. One more story of relationships, and this one might be a little less familiar to you. This is Julian Huxley. He's a British biologist who was very important in the internationalization of the conservation movement. Again, as I mentioned, when conservation moved outside of modern conservation moved outside of Europe and North America, it tended to follow colonial paths, and there were some attendant problems, which I'll talk about. But Julian Huxley was very important in recognizing that conservation efforts could not be limited to Europe and North America, that there were many species that were worth protecting elsewhere, and that the conservation movement needed to figure out how to do that. And he worked for the UN for several years, and he was instrumental in the creation of the IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, which still exists today and is still one of the most important international institutions in conservation, because it brings together nonprofits and governments and agency representatives to talk about, as I said, conserving species across boundaries. Now, if the name Huxley is familiar to you, but Julian Huxley is not familiar to you, you may have heard of his brother, Aldous. Looks a little threatening there, but the author of the dystopian novel Brave New World, and very famous in his time as an essayist and a thinker. And these two brothers were very close, and they disagreed. Julian Huxley they both had quite progressive ideas, but Julian Huxley's methods were, he was a great believer in centralized authority and kind of planned societies. He believed that society, kind of a technocracy, that society should be run by scientists. And Aldous Huxley, if you've read Brave New World, was rather horrified by this idea. But they shared they were very close as brothers, and they shared a lot of common interests, and they carried on this lifelong correspondence that's just fascinating to read. So, excuse me. So they, a couple of decades after a few years after the founding of the IUCN by Julian Huxley, a researcher named Eleanor Ostrom came on the scene and took up the problem of practicing conservation on an international scale. And her answer to Julian Huxley and to many of the conservationists who had come before her was, what we have ignored is what citizens can do. So as I mentioned earlier, there is this problem of elitism in the roots of conservation, and in a distrust of ordinary people's ability to manage their local wildlife, which is ironic because people have been doing that for millennia. Eleanor Ostrom, who was trained as a political scientist and an economist, really spent much of her career as a researcher studying how people managed their shared resources. And what she was pushing back against was not only this long history of elitism and conservation, but more immediately pushing back against the tragedy of the commons. And I'm sure most of you have heard the phrase tragedy of the commons. If you haven't seen the original paper was published in Science in 1968. It was an essay. I think it's important to point out it was an essay and not a piece of research, because it was published in Science. Many people assume it was a piece of research, but it was an essay based on Garrett Hardin, who was an ecologist, based on Garrett Hardin's observations and judgments about how the world works. And it became like clear later in life that Garrett Hardin had some very definite prejudices against immigrants and people of color in general. And so those were not explicit in in his essay, but in retrospect are quite clear. It continues to be one of the journal's most cited and most requested papers. And it argues that unless shared resources are privatized or controlled by an external authority, the quote unquote tragedy is inevitable, that people will just pursue their individual interests until whatever the shared resources is used up. And now Eleanor Ostrom, I'm sorry, let me say first that this was a very, what we would now call a sticky idea. It's the perfect meme. You know immediately what it means. And we see it all the time in our daily lives, right? So, and we have many examples of it throughout history. Speaking of bison, this is a picture of bison skulls piled up outside a fertilizer plant in Michigan in the late 1800s. On a much more mundane level, I'm sure many of you have experienced the tragedy of the poop commons. If you have walked in a local park, anytime you're in a traffic jam or a dirty public toilet, you're experiencing a minor tragedy of the commons. So it's easy to assume, to read this and think, oh, of course, that's just how humanity works. We're just selfish jerks, and there's really no hope for us to be able to manage resources in a reasonable way. But Eleanor Ostrom, who had done her PhD research on groundwater users in California, knew that this was not the case. And she had seen these groundwater users, without resorting to state control or to radical privatization, had seen them work out a messy but workable system for sharing their very scarce, very valuable resource. And I really like this idea of hers. We are neither trapped in inexorable tragedies nor free of moral responsibility. So the tragedy of the commons is not inevitable, but the somewhat bad news is we have a responsibility to to keep it from happening. It takes systems that are designed cooperatively, designed through often a lot of work, a lot of sitting in meetings and arguing, in order to keep people, in order to build a system that people can rely on to both provide them with a livelihood and keep this, whatever the valuable resource in question is, and keep a supply of that available over the long term. So Eleanor Ostrom, as I said, dedicated her career to documenting societies and groups that had worked out systems for sharing resources. And some of these systems have been in existence for hundreds of years. Methods of sharing forests, timber, pastures, fisheries. There are examples from all over the world. And during my research on the book, I got to visit Namibia, which is a young country in Southern Africa. It was achieved independence in 1990. And one of the first actions of the newly independent government was to formalize a system of community-led conservancies that had been started in a very grassroots way in the 1980s. And this was really putting Eleanor Ostrom's work into action. It was the people who founded these conservancies wanted to restore the ability of local people to manage their resources. They wanted to restore what had the connection between people and their wildlife, people and the wildlife that lived alongside, that had really been disrupted by colonization, and in many cases by the establishment of national parks that were created in a top-down way in places where people already had a pretty good working relationship with their local species. And once the parks came in Namibia and elsewhere, local people lost the benefits of conservation. In many cases, they weren't benefiting from They were no longer able to hunt um, using the systems they had developed, and they were not able to benefit from tourism. And then they also carried the benefits, or they also carried the burdens of conservation, in the sense that they still had to live near wildlife that in many cases was troublesome and could be threatening, but they didn't, because they didn't no longer had the authority to manage it. They were sometimes put at greater risk. So the conservancies in Namibia and elsewhere are an effort to devolve some measure of control to local people, and also to shift the burdens and benefits of conservation so that more of the benefits are returned to the local level. And I spent some time in Namibia in 2019, and it was a really eye-opening experience. I had heard about community-led conservation, but seeing it in action firsthand was quite something. I got to go to a meeting that looked something like the one on the lower right-hand corner, where a conservancy was meeting to talk about the local, to talk about the state of local wildlife and decide on hunting quotas for the coming year, given the data they had collected. And I was so struck sitting there. This was a meeting where there was, it started late. There was an argument over some minor case of corruption, and it ended in kind of a chaotic way. And I stood up and I was like, why am I so exhilarated? And I thought, wow, this is one of the first times I've been in a meeting where people have all agreed that it's important to protect these species for the long term. And I think I had been listening for that kind of agreement since I was working in the Southwest as a wildlife technician. Even though these community conservancy systems had not solved poverty, they had not made conservation free, people were still having to expend effort. And I'm sorry. I'll continue. I thought I heard something. They were still willing. They wanted to see their wildlife continue, and they were willing to go to some trouble to ensure that happened. So just to wrap up here, I don't want to leave you with the idea that Namibia is a singular case. There are many places where community-led conservation is happening. In fact, the Bezos Fund just this week gave something like $400 million to global conservation, and some of that went to indigenous land tenure. So not a huge percentage of the Bezos fortune, but but extremely meaningful to some of these grassroots groups that are working to conserve species at a local level in the interest of helping people live alongside these species that they value so much. And these are some of in fact, a couple of these organizations received some of the Bezos money this week, and they were quite involved in the latest meeting of the IUCN, which happened this fall. And they are more and more involved in the global conversation about conservation, which is, it's not enough and it's long overdue, but I think it's a really hopeful trajectory for the conservation movement. And so finally, Elinor Ostrom, this is Elinor Ostrom, I think a couple of years before her death and after she was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2009, I believe. She was always very cautious about what she called panaceas. People were always trying to get her to boil down her theories to, Ostrom's law, and she knew how destructive the idea of the tragedy of the commons had been. And so she never wanted a simple answer. She would always say, no, community-led conservation isn't always the answer. Sometimes you do need state control. Sometimes you do need to privatize. Every ecosystem, every community is different. And she would say, so don't always be trying to simplify things. And we've got to get to the point where we're not just accepting complexity, but we're actually putting it to use. The systems we are trying to protect, the ecological systems we are trying to protect, are very complex, and we need a complex movement that's working at a lot of different levels that's integrated at a lot of different levels, in order to successfully protect that complexity. So she says, as she said, we've got to get to the point where that we can understand complexity and harness it and not reject it. And if I could offer her a bumper sticker, and because I think one of the reasons her resistance to panaceas was admirable, but one of the reasons why she's not better known is that there is no slogan as powerful as the tragedy of the commons, to reflect her ideas. If I could suggest one, it would take a couple of words from this quote and just say harness complexity. So thank you so much for listening. I'm happy to take questions and or talk about anything else you might be interested in.
If people want to ask questions, please remember to unmute yourself in the bottom left corner of your screen.
I was just curious about one of your earlier pictures at the very beginning. It looked like Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir, but I wasn't sure.
Yeah, it was. It
Yeah.
was. There's Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir, and then there's Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was in because it's I forget. I think it's Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote a book about Roosevelt along with Pinchot, and so I was just curious. And I don't know if that's in your book, if there's any discussion around that. I mean,
Yeah.
Roosevelt was pretty controversial, obviously, as a great worldwide hunter, but also very instrumental in promoting some very innovative things.
Yeah, I mean, he was one of those early figures like Hornaday, who we have so much, he was so complicated, but we have so much to thank for. I mean, and Roosevelt especially, I mean, he created national parks and monuments, and, you know, just left this legacy of conservation that I think we still benefit from today. He and I got to read about his relationship with Pinchot, and I think Pinchot is a really undervalued character in conservation history. He was a very interesting guy, and really a forerunner in this idea that you know, we have to excuse me, that conservation is about humans, and we have to think about human behavior in conservation. But I also loved reading about Roosevelt and Muir and their camping trip that they took together in Yosemite, and they apparently just kind of annoyed the heck out of each other for the first day, and then and then came to some sort of agreement and had a great time for the next couple of days. So I'm sure we would all love to have been a fly on the wall during those days.
Oh, yes.
Or a fly at the campfire, so to speak.
I was wondering, the other day I found a feather, and I like to collect feathers. I don't know if that's legal or not. Birds molt all the time, and I'm sure this was a molted, looked like a feather that a bird had lost naturally or something. It was with other feathers. Is it illegal to hold feathers of wild birds, or?
Probably someone listening knows better than me about the specific regulations. I know that eagle feathers are protected under a different law, and I'm not sure what the Migratory Bird Treaty Act has to say about, you know, incidental feather collecting. It seems harmless to me, especially if you've picked it off the ground. But
yeah, maybe someone even knows. I'm not sure. I think most birds molt at some time or another.
Oh, yeah.
I think technically you do need to have a permit. Spokane Audubon has a permit to have scientific specimens for display, and that includes feathers as well as study skins and mounted specimens. So, and nests and eggs, I think all of that are technically protected.
I hadn't thought about it. I just recently realized I'm becoming enlightened by becoming a member of the Audubon Society. But it just occurred to me that, birds, I don't know, but I keep reading more and more about different birds that molt, and I know that ducks do. And but I think many birds molt and just lose their feathers and gradually and then regrow them. Is that true, or?
Some species, I think some species have complete molts twice a year, like the goldfinch, because it's got a winter plumage and a summer plumage.
Oh,
And then other species, I'm not sure if they lose all their feathers within a year or not, but they certainly replace their primary feathers and tail feathers. Whether they replace all the body feathers, I'm not sure.
what about turkey feathers? I mean, of course, wild turkeys are different than domesticated turkeys, but I mean, so it doesn't matter what wild animal or wild bird it is, you can't have even a part of it collected. And what if you have a hunting license and you shot a duck or something like that? Can you keep the feathers, or I suppose you can harvest the meat? But
I think since it's a hunted species, you can keep the feathers from a species that you can hunt and kill.
probably have to have a hunting license or be able to prove that you have one or something.
Right.
That's interesting. I don't want to get arrested.
I would suggest those rules are to protect against excesses. And it seems like, if you don't have a rule, people will go to excess. For instance, gathering eggs from nests and shooting birds to get the feathers, etc. I would just keep in mind, do no harm, and I don't think you're going to have much problem. But that's not an official position of the Audubon Society, of course. But
Well, thanks for the advice.
and I had a question, Michelle.
Yeah.
I really appreciated the way that you wrote the book. It didn't seem terribly offensive to any particular perspective, and I was curious, how has it been received with non-environmentalists, let's say? Do you have some feel for that?
Do you mean by people who are just interested, not, or people who are more anti-environmental?
Right. I was gonna say, people that would normally be looking for a fight, are they a little less likely to do so because of the way you put it, or do you have any perspective?
I hope so. I mean, unfortunately, people who are really anti-environmental are not likely to pick up my book. And that's just, an artifact of how siloed information has become. But I've heard from a lot of people. I mean, I think it's been gratifying to hear from people who are professionals in the field who, maybe didn't know the details of the history or appreciate having some of the dark parts of it aired out for discussion. It's really gratifying to hear from professionals who have found it helpful. And it's also gratifying, maybe on the other end of the spectrum, to hear from people who really haven't thought much about conservation, are idly interested in it and have found the history as a help. Have just found the history to be a way of entry into a problem that they might have felt like, oh, it's so overwhelming, extinction, I don't even want to think about it. But reading about the human stories of people who have done or tried to do something about it, I think has worked for some people, and that's gratifying.
I would agree. I mean, it seemed very accessible. Certainly, I don't have a anti-environmentalist mentality, so I can't fully assess how someone would we received that, but it seemed very accessible, and I don't see how you could write it any more so. But I hope that it does some good work in that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, I tried hard to make it a good read while not getting across as much of the complexity as I could.